And I just wanted to thank the library's Art Advisory Council for their generous support of today's program. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. Roshanak Keyghobadi is an artist and scholar who teaches art and design at Farmingdale State College. Roshanak writes and gives presentations about contemporary art and artists, and her art reviews and essays have been published in various professional art and design publications. She regularly exhibits her works in museums and galleries nationally and internationally, and her artworks have been featured in several art books and magazines. Roshanak holds a doctoral degree in art and art education from Columbia University and her MFA from Indiana University at Bloomington and BFA from University of Arts, Philadelphia. They're both in graphic design. She studied art and design at Tehran University in Iran before moving to the United States. Roshanak is a visiting assistant professor at the Visual and Communications Department at Farmingdale State College and also teaches art classes and workshops in Art Circle Studio in Syosset, New York. Roshanak's artwork is currently on display in the library's Adler Gallery through the month of December. And she's joining us today to discuss her creative process and explain how she deconstructs and reconstructs printed materials to create new works of art. Please welcome Roshanak Keyghobadi.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you all for being here and joining the presentation. I'll be walking you through some of my work and the process. And I think at the end, we have time for any questions. So I'll be gladly answering any questions that you have. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So this is my studio, just to give you an idea of where I work. It is a home studio and it is my office. I use it for making art and also preparing for my classes. So before the COVID, I was also teaching in my studio a series of art classes, private art classes, but then I continued with that over the Zoom, and to this day still we have classes going on. If you have visited the library already, you probably have seen the cases there. There are two cases. One is devoted to my tools, the materials and tools that I use for my work. And in this case, you can see handmade paper over here, some work in progress over here. These are my tools, needle, thread, scissors, pins, and then other materials such as newspapers and magazines that I have. And I sometimes combine them together, the English magazines and the Persian magazines, or I do separate pieces. But I thought it would be nice to just show everyone all the materials and how I'm using them to put together my work. And what I do actually with stitching is basically drawing. I'm drawing with my thread. I'm using the needle to create that line. So I'm not really creating embroideries or any kind of decorative patterns. I'm basically using my needle and thread as my medium, like a pen or pencil. Something else that I wanted to mention is, if you take a notice over here, this New York Times belonged to Port Washington Library. Reference, this is a recycled newspaper that I was lucky enough to have and use in my artwork. And you'll see the two pieces that I created from the Port Washington Library's recycled newspapers. But I'm sure that a lot of you are thinking, but how do you make paper? These are all my handmade papers that I use in my work. Just to go over it, oops, I don't know why it's doing this. Basically, I shred the paper, and then I put the paper in the blender, add water to it, and what I get is pulp, paper pulp. And add more paper to a container, mix the pulp with the water, and that will loosen up the pulp. And with that, I can actually use my mold and decal. The mold is the frame with the screen underneath, and the decal is the frame without the screen. And what it does is when I put the decal and mold in the tub, I lift up the pulp and the water is drained, and I will get a piece of paper like that, but it's still wet. So I have to leave it to dry up. But these are the end results of this process. And this is how it's done. Blending and putting the screen in the vat and then scooching. That's what it's called, just to pressing the piece of paper pulp onto the surface. Usually it's felt. And then you lift it up, and there you go. You have your piece of paper. These are different kind of papers that you get. You can actually embed different materials into the paper, and you can press anything that you like into the paper. In this case, this is dried flowers. But what I do is I actually embed a newspaper, and then I sewed on top of this. These are my two studies of white on white. And you can also see here that I have embossed paper. So when it's wet, I can press and create these kind of images and textures. These are all embossed and embedded paper that you see here. And I can, when the paper is still wet, I can add elements and materials to my paper, like you see on the edge here. These are twigs and branches. Other materials, the newspapers that I already showed you, art books. When I find art books, I cut them, I put it back together, and I deconstruct them and reconstruct them again. So these are some images of my workplace, workspace that I have for you. And these are basically my sketches. I don't do a lot of sketches. I just directly go to the artwork, but sometimes just to try out the materials, the background and the foreground, the color of the thread that I want to use, if I have new materials that I'm adding, just to see how it feels, how it looks. I do small sketches like this. Now you can see these in the exhibition. These three are very small pieces that I started with, and you can see the embedding here. Some of these bits and pieces that you see, they're actually within the paper. When I was creating the pulp and mixing the pulp with water in the vat, I added the shredded paper to it. And then when I was lifting the paper, it became part of the paper. But in some areas, I also go in and add the image and the particles and the paper, the newspaper, the words on top of what I already have. I may glue them, or I may stitch them like what you see here. So part of these artworks are accidental. I have no control over where the pulp and the piece of newspaper sit and the whole composition works. But then afterwards, when I look at them, I can gain control over where I put the stitches, if I want to add anything to the piece, and then I can make it more balanced in a way. So these were just three different sketches and ideas on smaller format to see how can I make curves, how can I work with straight lines, and then what happens if I stitch in a diagonal. These two are a pair studying circles. And again, you can see embossing here underneath. And these were in fact part of the paper. These are embedded in the paper. And then I did the stitching. These three also belong to another series. They are square pieces that I limited myself to 3 colors for thread, white, black, and red, and wanted to see how I can work with angles and diagonals and circles, long stitches, and also organic stitching here. And as you can see, there are rough edges here. We have some have more contrast in them and some less contrast. But I'm sure that you have noticed that although this whole process of paper making is very, I would like to call it chaotic, you have no control over where the pulp sits, and especially when you're embedding materials into the pulp, you have no control over it. But then the graphic designer in me tells me to put some order into things that are coming out of that vat, and it's dried up, and how can I organize my elements on this composition. So that's why you're seeing all of these grids and separations and constructions, where I started with this deconstructing, and now I'm reconstructing the whole thing again. So there's that dichotomy in my work, kind of like pull and push of the chaotic and the balance, the chaotic and the control. So you can see it happening in my other works as well. These are a series that I did, which are devoted to Iranian women and their situation. So you can see each of them having different messages. Even if you cannot read the text in my work, my aim is for the viewer to look at the texture, look at the composition, and with the letters and the type, appreciating the form and what you see in it, even if you cannot read it. For those of you who can read it, there's another layer of meaning added to these works that you can decipher them. And in a lot of my work, even if you can read what it says, it still doesn't make sense, because I tend to detach the meanings and mismatch things, move and shift words and sentences so they don't make sense anymore. So even if you can read them, you know how to read Persian, in a lot of these works, probably you cannot follow what's happening. In some places you can make sense of it because I kept some of the lines intact, but in others, they become chaotic, just like the pulp, just like the paper. This is one of my 3 larger pieces that I worked on after the small ones. I started to look at larger pieces to see if I can control a larger composition. It is hard to stitch a larger composition like that, but I wanted to challenge myself and see how can I create that balance within this kind of format. And these usually take a long time. What you see in my exhibition is the result of many, many years of going back and forth, looking at my work, creating one, putting it aside, maybe coming back to it. In some works, I probably have cut it out, use it in different pieces so that original work doesn't exist anymore. But it's a lot of looking at my work and going back and forth until I think at that moment it is done. But you never know, it may not be done. So in this case, you can see I started this and I looked at it. These areas I added later on, because when you look at a piece that is larger, you have to really stand back and see how it works. And the same thing here. I wanted to experiment with division of spaces and the textures that I can create with these within those spaces, and what are the different ways that I can separate type and still work with it. This piece is called Quilt, and this piece is made out of the leftovers of the other two pieces that I just showed you. This one and this one. So whatever that I had left over, I used in this piece. So if you look at the back of this piece, you see all of the extra stitching going on in there. And I followed the logic of a simple quilt, having it, giving it a border, a center, and then a very symmetrical composition. Although the background and the paper is very chaotic, but again, I'm creating all of these, if you can see the white squares here. These are what I attempted to look like a quilt. This is called and over here, meaning and. And I wanted to see how can I stitch 3 pieces together and make a straight piece. Also, how die cutting works. Die cutting is what's happening here when you have a window open, kind of that you can see through the page. It's cut out of that original piece. These 3 are a series that I call them Osterlop. And Osterlop is a device that was invented for finding your way. Iranians use this device to find their way, guiding people, showing the position of the sun and the moon and stars and how to find your way. Planets and stars played an important role in early days of travel, so that's how you found your way. And for me, this is kind of like a map that I created for myself to guide me through, connect me to home, or with the embedded materials that I have here, to connect myself to my direction, to where I'm going. And I should also mention that all of the materials that I used in these 3 are all created from magazines that were published in one day. So the way that I get these magazines is I asked my aunt in Iran to buy them and send them for me. So at a point, I asked her to go out one day and get like 5 or 10 magazines and newspapers that have the date of the same day and send it to me. So basically these 3 are carrying the news and events or whatever that is related to that one day. This piece I titled Useless Clues for Unsolvable Puzzles. As you can see, we have puzzles here and we have the clues close to the puzzles, but these clues cannot solve any of these puzzles. That's why they're useless. And it's just a play between what is a puzzle, how can we solve it, are the puzzles solvable, and it becomes a little bit more philosophical, but again, along the ways of creating chaos and order and deconstructing and reconstructing some ideas. This one I titled It Is My Turn or My Turn, where you see here, it says Novat man ham rasid. And these are all these red type that you see are the headlines of magazine articles. And usually the magazine that I use is a very specific magazine that I ask to be sent to me. It's called Rah Zindagi. Rah Zindagi means the way of life or the path to life. And this particular magazine has a lot of stories about families, especially women, in different situations. So it's page after page of narrative and stories that you can read. And over here, you can see all of them are embedded in the background. And these are the headings of those stories. But then again, none of these stories make sense because I cut them and I piece them together. So story of one person becomes attached to another person's story. And in a sense, this whole piece is multiple stories that become one. And we can also look at it in this way that we are all very similar. Our stories may be very different. We have many, many different experiences. But when you look at the core of it, we are all humans and we're struggling with the same kind of issues, no matter where you're from. It is the same human condition that we're dealing with. These are my experiments with colored thread. So getting out of the red, black, and white, and looking into what are the possibilities of different threads and what can it do for me? Does it add anything to my work? And this piece is called Death, Life, Death. And I divided it into 4 parts, basically 4 seasons of life. So you have summer, winter, fall, and spring. And again, I have letters and type on there. I also experimented with colored pulp. You can make your pulp colorful by adding pigment to it. And you can see here we have pink. In fact, it was red that I added, but when it's diluted with water and pulp, it becomes pink. You can see some hints of red here. And these are also embedded, all these threads. You can get them in there, and then I stitch some on top. These are some other colors that are created with pulp and mixing pigment and pulp. This piece is called Where is Home? And this part is again all inner voices, kind of like as if you're in someone's mind. These are all little sentences that I cut out of different stories, and it became maybe my voice in my head. And since we're dealing with home, I'm also questioning where is home. Is it the larger home that we all share? Is it the physical home that we're living in? Is it our bodies? Is it our mind, the home that we store all of our thoughts and knowledge and feelings and in a sense what I have over here on the side? All of these different thoughts and different feelings. And again, you can see embedding here. Now I'm embedding flowers, dried flowers, and plants. These two pieces are, I call them dialogues because I combined the works of two artists together that I thought that they're kind of like having a dialogue, not with each other, but what they did kind of relate to each other. So obviously, most of you know Degas. This is Edgar Degas. And then Sultan Muhammad, he was a Persian miniature painter. And both of them are showing a dance. So this is a dance scene. People are playing instruments and people are dancing here. And also we have famous Degas ballet classes. So how do you incorporate these two together? How do you relate them together? And have that dialogue going with Sultan Muhammad and Degas. And over here, the same thing. This time, this is Mir Ali and Van Gogh. And Mir Ali's work is here. This is a tradition that we call golomorg in Persian, meaning the flower and the bird. And this is Van Gogh's painting. And again, I found that really interesting connection between these two, and I wanted to put them together to have that conversation going. This is part of my own calligraphy that I added and some of the headlines. And this is the description of Mir Ali's work. This is a three-dimensional piece that is hung in the gallery. It can move, it is very light. So if there's a slight movement in the gallery, it can move and you can see all around it. But since it's pinned to the wall, you cannot see it that way. But it's called fragments, and it's just different parts of the body that are fragmented, and you can focus on just one part of the body. I also went back to die cutting and detaching and attaching again. This is one of the pieces that I was referring to that I made with the newspaper, recycled newspaper from Port Washington Library. And I combined it with pieces of the Persian painting art book that I showed you at the beginning. And it's called Accidental. And this is the back of this piece. I thought it would be interesting for you to see the back of these pieces. How do they look? I find them very interesting. The back has a totally different look and different texture, and you can even frame these, not ignoring the front. This is the other piece that I created with the Port Washington Library's recycled newspapers. And it is more colorful. The other one was basically concentrating on red, black, and white. And this one, I tried to add more color because my images suggested that. It was just right to do different colored threads. And this is called The Secret of the Puzzle. And you can see that I have puzzles here again. And these are some details of that piece. And a lot of people ask me, how can you stitch so straight and uniform? First, it is practice, because I've done it so many times. I I know how to do it, and I'm sure anyone who practices can do it. But to get it straight, I draw lines. I use my pencil and ruler, and I draw lines. I make circles, and I make holes, and I just go through the holes. And in a lot of my works, when you look at them closer, when you go to the gallery, you see I don't erase these lines, because I believe that this is part of my process, and they should be there. This is more information. This has more character. It also describes how I work. Another technique that I explored and worked with is, there are actually two techniques. One is paper weaving, and you see how it's done here. Just weaving strips of paper together, and then also piercing the paper to create that texture. And this piece is called Anonymous. I also did a series of compositions with only newspaper, and looking at what is available in a newspaper. Beside the letters and the type that is bold or light or italic, small or large, there are other elements in a newspaper that are really exciting, like all the colors of the rules. Advertisements have colors. So what I did was detaching these, cutting them, and using bits and pieces as my material. So these yellow pieces you see are yellows from the advertisements in the newspaper. These reds are the rules of headlines that I'm using. The images are from reports, or we have some of these are ads for people who are lost or deceased. So like all of the different varieties of compositions that I could make with just what I could find in magazines and newspapers, creating textures and movement, contrast with the elements that I had. And this is what you can see in the exhibition, 4 separated pieces, but when they come together, they create this circle. In the other case, in the gallery, you can see a group of my handmade books. These are all done and created with handmade paper. This first book is Yellow Pages. I don't know how many of you remember Yellow Pages. Yellow Pages is a phone book, a very thick phone book that I recycled some of the pages and created paper with that. So you can see this is the book standing, and this is opened up. And usually what you did with the Yellow Pages is you were obviously looking for someone's phone number, and then you found that you needed pencil to write it down, or keep it, don't forget it. That's why we have pencils here. This is called a Red Rose book, and this is my experiment with circular paper. How can I make paper in a circle, and how can I attach these circles together to create this continuous accordion book? The covers are loose, but then I bundle them up with the string. This is called the Road Trip book, and basically it is a book of photographs that I took while traveling from New York to California, a road trip, and combined with the handmade paper and some materials that are more like heavy duty, lend themselves to that trip. This is my sound book. And the reason it's called sound book is because they're attached to these bells. And anytime that you touch this book, it makes sounds and it jingles. And again, these are all the pages are handmade paper, colored handmade paper. Another series of my books are books that are I bound together. The first one is this one, which is Roshanak Keyghobadi. And it's a collection of different pages that hold one poem of Sohrab Sepehri, who's a very famous Persian poet in Iran. And I selected that poem to create this book. These are all handmade paper that you see up here. And I also designed the fabric here. What you see, the panels are stamped fabric. And the handwriting is mine also. I wrote the whole thing. These are pieces of dyed paper. You can color the paper like the whole piece of paper, or you can have parts of the paper in color. That's what's happened here. So you can splash color pulp when you're creating the pages, and the result would be something like this. Each of these pages are different. And this book is a book of, again, one poem by Forough Farrokhzad, who is also a very well-known Persian poet. And this one is in English, Those Days on Ruzha. And I just wrote the whole poem in several pages here. This book is my snow book. Snow always reminds me of home. This paper was so suitable for this subject matter, because when you look at the texture of this paper, you can see all of these embedded materials in it that reminded me of when on a snowy day, when you walk around, you see different materials being mixed with the snow underneath your feet. And this is the feeling that I got. And the pages that you see in this book are all photographs of a snowy day that I took, and then I added to my the pages of my book. And I also did ceramics, and these beads are handmade. Now, during the pandemic and the isolation times that we all experienced, I started making daily walks, long daily walks. And I would pick up different materials on my way during my walks. I would stop and take photos. And what I did was picking up sticks, things that were on the side of the road, broken, unwanted, ignored, and I started wrapping them. And I shared this also with my students that I teach. So this became a project that we all did, and it was very calming. It was like a meditation. It involved a slow process that you couldn't speed up. You had to be patient to tie all of these sticks and decide what colors you want to use. And because we were all confined to our homes, we had to find things that were available around us at home. What kind of yarn you have, what kind of ribbons you can use. And that's basically the result of this project. This is the longest stick that I wrapped. And this is the beginning of putting it together, just to show you how to look at different materials that you have, how to decide which one is more suitable to add. And these you can see in the exhibition. They are mounted on the wall. Now this one is a little different because it's a collection, it's a bundle of sticks, and I call this the 2020 wrap because this is maybe something that a lot of people felt like, that you're confined, you're wrapped, and you're stuck. So maybe this is how I was trying to express my feeling. And this is how it's mounted in the exhibition. The other piece that I did during the isolation is my bundle, 2020 bundle. And this is, again, another project I did with my students remotely. And basically what you see here, these four parts are wrapped Starbucks cardboard trays that you use for carrying your drinks. So you have 8 of those trays here that I put 2 of them together in each section, and then I started bundling them and sewing and sewing, and this is the end result. This is in the exhibition. Another thing that I got really involved in 2012 is the garments that I make. And this is the very first garment that I made. And this is related to my research that I was doing for my doctoral degree at Columbia. This garment is holding my conversation and my interviews with Reza Bedini, who's a very famous graphic designer. And I had a conversation with him about art, typography, graphic design. And it was done through Skype at that time. This is worth like many, many hours of interview. But to me, it felt like, because I was not sitting there in front of him, seeing him, and doing this through Skype, there was that lack of the person. That's why I created this garment. This is like a garment without the person who's supposed to be wearing it. These are all the words, these are all the ideas. And this was the very first of the series that I did. This I call Chat Jame. Chat is chat, Jame means garment. And then I started to work on 2 more. This one is Furuq Jame, and this one is Sohrab Jame. And this one is devoted to Furuq Farrokhzad, that I explained. She's a very famous poet, Iranian poet. Sohrab Sepehri also, they both passed away. But they're very well known and beloved poets in Iran. So this is Furuq Jama and this is Sohrab Jama. And what I wrote on these 2 are, for Furuq is her writings and also her poetry. And for Sohrab is all his poems. And there's a front and a back to these 2. But unfortunately, you can't see the backs in the exhibit. And this is my process. I should also mention that these garments, all 3 garments, were sewn by my mother perfectly, and I was able to write on them. So this is how I start. I do my diagrams, I sketch in my sketchbook, and then decide on the final design and start writing. And I did these with all permanent markers. So this is the front of Furuq Jame, and this is the back of Furuq Jame. So all my handwriting and their words. Some time ago, I I like to do challenges for myself, to set challenges for myself. So at some point I did the challenge of 100 drawings, 100 days. And this is part of my sketchbooks. And the reason I'm showing these is for you to see all of the different things that contribute to coming up with ideas. And it relates to this one also. These are scratchboard drawings that I did 20 years ago, or like 2000. And again, this was another challenge for myself to do one of these a day. I did around like 20 of these. And from this, I came up with this idea. You can see this mirror in the exhibition. And this is a mirror that it reads آینه برابر آینت میگذارم تا از تو ابدیتی بسازم. And this is by Ahmad Shamlu, another very prominent Iranian poet. And it means I put a mirror in front of your mirror to make you infinite. So the reason that I came up with this idea was because I did this. So it gave me the idea. Basically, scratchboard is when they cover the board with black paint, and then you scratch the black paint to reveal the white underneath. And this is what I did here. I got a mirror. I painted the mirror all black with black paint, and then I started scratching the surface of the mirror to reveal some parts of the mirror and to do the poem. And finally, one day in our yard, I found this beautiful nest that I was on the ground after a storm. And I looked at it carefully, and I was just so fascinated with how it was made, the bird, the way that she put it together, all the materials and the mud and what made it stick together, and how she planned it. It was marvelous. So I said, I want to do something with it. I want to do a collaborative project with the bird. So that's what I did. I found, I was going through the New York Times and found the section on home decorating and all the tips on how to decorate your room, how to put pieces together, what is the best items to choose. And I combined that with this nest, with my red thread and all of the lines of this article about home improvement and decorating. And that's it. That's my presentation. Before I say goodbye, I want to say thank you to Port Washington Library Art Advisory Council, and specifically Linda Sandman, Lazy Daisy, Betty Gimbel, and Port Washington Library staff, Vanessa, Amy, Jeff, Bob, Michelle, Philip, and Flaminio. Thank you so much.
This was so wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear all the process and how you put everything together. It's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I don't know about Bob, but I do have some questions from AJ. Are you ready for questions?
Yes.
Excellent.
I have a question too.
Okay, perfect. How long does it take to make the paper from shredding to the dried final piece of paper?
Well, it doesn't take a lot of time for doing the whole process of making the paper, but it takes some time for the paper to dry. So you have to give it time to dry. But you have to collect the pieces that you want. If you are doing the newspaper, if you're recycling newspaper, or I don't recommend magazines because they're glossy. You can reuse the printer paper, the white paper. And what you have to do is just soak the water, soak the shredded paper in the water. That may take like a night, overnight, so it loosens it up. And then all you have to do is just put it in the mixer and blend it, get the pulp, and do the whole process. But then you have to wait for it to dry. So it's probably like from start to finish. If it's summer, which I highly recommend that you do it in summer, it takes maybe 3-4 days for the start to the finish.
So, and he also he has several other questions. Does the glossy paper from magazines work well as the newspaper? You had said no, but you can use the magazines. You can embed the magazine in the paper.
It has ink that is, it doesn't stick together that well. You have to remember the only sticking agent when you're making paper is water. That's all that makes everything stick together. And then with glossy magazines, you can try it, but I don't recommend it. I'm all for experimentation, so why not? You can do it, see what happens, but I usually don't use glossy magazines.
And the next question, you must have infinite patience to have hand stitched some of the more intricate pieces. Have you ever strayed in mid stitching from the guidelines that you originally drew from the piece? In other words, do you stay on track with your original vision of the final piece, or are you open to changes as you go along?
I'm very open to changes. I love them. I embrace any accidents, any mishaps, because they add character to the work. My aim is not to be perfect. It is, for me, it's the whole process. I enjoy the whole process, and if something happens, I embrace it. It's not a mistake for me.
Excellent. That's all I have. Bob, did you have some too?
Yes, I do. First of all, Patty wants to know, what kind of glue do you use?
For the pieces that I put together and I glue, I just use glue stick, Elmer's glue stick. That's the best glue that I can use for flat surfaces.
And then Mariam asks, how does materiality interact with making meaning in your work? Are the words and text you use aiming to convey a message?
Yes and no. It depends who are looking at the work also. Obviously, if you can read Persian, automatically you want to draw a meaning out of the work, because you see the words, you want to make sense of it, and you want to see what it means, how it's put together. But if you don't read Persian, it's just the textures that I'm looking for. I mean, to begin with, the material is the most important thing in my work for me. The texture, the way that it's put together, the colors, even when I was talking about the stitching, that's why I just use stitches as lines. I don't get into decoration, and I don't get into like really details of that. It's just lines for me. So material is very important for me.
And those were the two I had, Michelle, so far.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat now. All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. Bob, did you get anything?
I didn't.
All
Oh, wait
right,
a minute.
Okay.
Marianne also asks, were talismanic robes an inspiration for your shirts?
Yes, yes. I should mention that these are the shirts that, if you're familiar with them, they were shirts that were worn underneath armors before war. So it brings luck and well-being to the warrior. And usually they were covered with verses of Quran and protective verses. So yes, very much so.
All righty. Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank you again for that wonderful and very interesting presentation. That was fabulous. I'm so glad that you were able to come today, and I'm glad that your work is up through the end of December. It's just fabulous. I hope you all can come and see it.
I have
thank
one
you.
more question, Michelle.
Yes.
It's from, let's see, it's from Linda, and she wants to know, when doing calligraphy on fabric, how does it glide?
It depends on your tool. I find the permanent markers the best, especially the ones that are fine. The tip is fine. I always have to put something between the two layers so it doesn't show through. But permanent markers are good. You have to get used to it. You're right. There is a flow to it. You cannot just write on it like a regular paper. It has resistance to it, but you get used to it when you start doing it.
Very interesting. I had no idea. Great questions, everybody. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. I hope you all enjoyed the program. And thank you again to Roshanak
Thank you.
for the wonderful art.
I just want to mention that if you visit the gallery, I put a comments book there. It would be wonderful to hear from you and read your feedbacks. Please do. If you have time, go and visit. And it's a wonderful library. And I love the fact that it's not just an art gallery that specific people go to. It's everybody's there. The kids, I keep hearing their comments about my work, which is wonderful. So it is great to be there.